Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hey, Adam.
Oh,
And hello to the Gazette.com viewers. This is a special virtual edition of Pints and Politics. And I have a few announcements before we get started. First, I want to thank my three colleagues here. We actually pre-recorded this show earlier today. I messed up the Zoom meeting, and so I'm making them all redo it so everyone at home can watch. And so thank you all. And I also want to send our best wishes to our usual moderator, Aaron Jordan, who's not able to join us today. And I want to thank our season ticket holders who have been sticking with us through cancellations and postponements. We are working to schedule an extra Pints and Politics event in November to make up for the one that we missed. For all the latest information about Gazette events, you can visit thegazette.com/special events. There's a link for that here on that gazette.com webpage. And you can also, there's a link to sign up for the Pints and Politics newsletter. So tonight we're going to have a 1-hour discussion about Iowa and national politics. I am Gazette columnist Adam Sullivan. I'm joined by three of my colleagues. Lyz Lenz is a columnist at the Gazette. Hi, Liz. And Todd Dorman is also a columnist and insights editor. Hi, Todd.
Hello.
And we have political reporter James Lynch.
Here.
Obviously, COVID-19 is the big issue on everyone's mind today. As of this morning, we had 2,000 confirmed cases in Iowa, as well as 60 deaths, unfortunately. There are several readers who asked us about Governor Kim Reynolds' metrics for tracking the disease and for imposing new restrictions. Liz, I want to go to you first. You've been critical of the governor's approach. We had some new information this week, but do you think that that's satisfying?
no, it's not. The governor has not been transparent from day one. She talks a lot about data and metrics. In fact, I had an idea that we should do a drinking game that every time she says data and metrics, we take a shot, but we'd be dead.
That is not advisable. That is too much drinking.
Not advisable. But we have no idea what these data and metrics are. The Press Citizen was able to obtain a copy of some of these data and metrics, and that was some great reporting on their part. But when asked about it, the governor said, but we have other data and other metrics that we're using. So there just hasn't been full transparency. Anytime anybody asks her about specific data and metrics, she's will name maybe one or two things, but then mentions others. We don't have transparency on who's on her advisory council. She just hasn't told us this at all. So we don't know who's part of this decision-making process. And from what we do know, all of her data and metrics are lagging. So what we know about the virus is, there's a lot of people who could be asymptomatic carriers who carry it and never are sick at all and can walk around spreading it to other people. So all the governor's data is based upon who's sick right now, who's in the hospital right now. So we don't know what kind of modeling she's doing to project forward. In fact, we know that she doesn't really even have a model, any model that any university or anybody's kind of done for Iowa. She has criticized it and says she's not using that, but she just signed a contract with the University of Iowa a month into the pandemic for her own model. So
without the actual epidemiological model, what they've been using is a matrix. They've drawn these regions across Iowa, and just today, the region that includes Cedar Rapids and quite a few counties north of that, basically the northeast corner of the state, hit the threshold, right? So it hit 10, a score of 10 on a scale of 12, which doesn't really mean anything. But so under that, so there are now closer towards shelter in place order. So Todd and James, whoever wants to jump in, you both live in that region. What does that actually mean in practice right now?
Well, it means I had to kick 9 people out of my basement just before this broadcast because there's always quite a few people around here. But that sounds like we're not supposed to have gatherings beyond our household unless it's a funeral or a church service or something. There's a list of exceptions. I can't remember exactly all of them, but it's a step up from the 10 or less meetings and some of the she led us to believe that 10 gets you shelter in place, and this isn't exactly, at least she's not calling it that. It's not exactly shelter at home, but it's a stepped up, and that's part of the problem with these metrics and data, is that, you know, even when you hit 10, you think you know what it means, but maybe it doesn't mean what you thought it meant. I don't know what happens at 12. I mean, that's got to be, I mean, I can't even speculate what would happen at 12.
Yeah. So I think under
fireworks, I don't know.
I think under her rules, you can do like you can go to funeral, wedding, and church service if you have fewer than 10 people. So if you want to have your 9 people over, then you could just like schedule a wedding every day, and I think it's okay.
Well,
what about a renewal of vows?
James, go ahead.
As a newspaper reporter, I don't think I'd ever get 10 people at my funeral anyway, so I don't think it's going to have any impact on me in that regard. I'm kind of like Todd. I thought when we hit 10, that was like the cutoff point when it was going to be shelter in place, stay at home. But it just seems like you can't have anybody over to your house, just immediate family members. So I'm not sure it's that much different than yesterday.
Well, and at the news conference today, she didn't really mention that this region had gone up to 10 until later in the newscast. There was a video with Ashton Kutcher. There was all sorts of other stuff before she finally got around to telling us that a large region of the state with a lot of population had new restrictions that didn't. It seems like that might have been the first thing she told us.
Bury the lead.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So this. Go ahead, Liz.
Sorry, Adam.
No, I was just going to say a question for you. So this, I mean, basically, so some social gatherings will be, you know, outlawed now, but enforcement is a problem. So we already had a situation in Cedar Rapids where there was some violence going on. It was a legitimate police concern, but then also these young people were also charged additionally for breaking the gathering rules. But these rules really, as far as we've seen, haven't really applied to businesses. So like it's been more of an educational approach towards institutions, where against a handful of individuals, at least, they've actually had charges. So Liz, I mean, where do you see the enforcement issues breaking down?
Well, we have seen the police, at least here in Cedar Rapids, be really reluctant to start charging people with violating the order. They can. It's a simple misdemeanor charge, but they just aren't. You know, there have been bar owners, there have been restaurants, there have been people gathering in large groups all across the city. The police have been called out there, but they haven't been charging for violating the governor's order. The only charges that we have seen are these 4 young individuals, people of color, who are charged, and they were out witnessing a fight, but you know, it's really frustrating to see how uneven this enforcement is, you know, because it's no less dangerous for, you know, a bunch of like middle-aged people in Marion to gather than it is for, you know, kids to fight in a park. Like at this point, with the level of contagious that this virus is, that it is just as deadly to do the one as the other. And so, you know, to just kind of see yet again an example of how enforcement disproportionately affects other people, specifically people of color, is just really upsetting, you know, and there is this mechanism where we could start enforcing some of this, because sadly many people are now taking it seriously, but you know, I wouldn't say, especially in the beginning, it was something that Iowans were taking very seriously. We had that huge horse auction with 600 people in it.
So yeah, those folks have apologized for the auction. They said they didn't expect that crowd, which I'm not sure that I buy that. But you know, the Cedar Rapids police chief has also talked about that, you know, they're trying to approach this with education. So yeah. I think we're probably past that point now. Everybody should be educated to the dangers of COVID-19 and the danger of gathering, and ought to receive the message that, you don't gather, you stay at home, those sorts of things. But
I mean, going to the horse auction though, that's just complete bonkers, because at that point, you know, we should not have been gathering in groups more than 10. Even if they didn't expect 600, it was still wildly irresponsible of them. And then the governor's response is to say, okay, well, no more auctions. You can have auctions, but keep it smaller. And if it's food animals, it can be up to like 25 people. So, I mean, I guess people are saying a lot of things, but there's no actual enforcement. And, you know, it's really a little bit silly of the police chief to say, oh, we're talking about education, and then the first people they go and charge are 4 young adults. Like, wouldn't those be some of the people you'd want to educate more than the grown individuals running bars and restaurants who've been talked to repeatedly? There's just some real ham-handedness going on in our city and our county and our state, and it's ridiculous, and it's going to kill people.
So we had a story in the paper this week by B.A. Morelli, who reports that the mayor of Cedar Rapids says that if bars are not complying with the orders, that he might use that as fodder when bars come back for their liquor license renewals. Todd, what do you think of that plan?
Yeah, you know, the way the law is written, the city does have some discretion. There's some oldie-timey language in there about, I think, like moral turpitude or some term where it's kind of leaves some gray area as to what does that mean.
I'll never get a liquor license now.
Well, I know that's kind of where I'm coming from too. But you know, I'm not 100% sure they can do what he's talking about. It's a good message to tell those folks that there could be consequences for having gatherings that jeopardize people's health. At the same time, like Liz says, this has got to be, everybody's got to get a talking to, or everybody's got to get a ticket. I mean, it's not, you can't just play this one person gets talked to, one person doesn't, you know, gets fined. I mean, it doesn't make sense. That's not how laws are supposed to be enforced.
Yeah, I'm on team. Everyone gets a very stern talking to, and no citations, no arrests. But that's just me. Let me go to you, James. So the legislature is on hiatus. The governor has some power and some spending authority. County governments are doing some things. Obviously, the federal government is doing some things. But at some point, the legislature will have to come back to do some basic stuff. Would you expect them to get into anything bigger than the bare bones stuff when they come back, for whenever they come back?
Not really. Right now, they're scheduled to come back April 30th, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that pushed back into May or even later. But I do think they'll come back. I don't think they'll have a 30-day session. Now they had about 30 days left in what's supposed to be a 100-day session. I don't expect them to be there for probably more than a week, if that long. I think the leaders will hammer out a budget and maybe some other legislation that they consider must do. The leaders will then go back and sell it to their caucuses through virtual meetings like this one. And then at some point they'll meet in Des Moines to actually pass the budget to meet their constitutional obligation. But I think, you know, by that time, things are going to look different. State revenues, they'll have a better handle on state revenues, which are going down because people aren't paying sales tax. People aren't earning income and paying income taxes. It's going to be, the revenue picture is not going to be as rosy as it was. They may have to face furloughs, employee furloughs or layoffs. I think the one thing that we can be sure of is that the governor is not going to order a 10% across the board increase like Chad Culver did, 10, 12 years ago. And he's still getting beat up for doing that. So I think that's off the table.
Well, maybe she could sell bonds to create an economic development program. Kim and debt don't rhyme, so that would be fine.
You know, and it's interesting that for the past few years, Republicans have proposed paying off those iJobs bonds early to save money. And there have been some hurdles in doing that. And once again, it came up, there was some discussion, at least among the Republican caucus. And now, because the casinos are closed and the casino revenue goes, the first thing, you know, it goes to pay off those bonds. Right. They're not going to pay them off early. They may have trouble paying them off, making the payment this year. So, yeah, nothing's easy.
Iowa just started with sports betting recently. That was supposed to be big for revenue. There's no sports happening. So I was wondering if we could have do prop bets on presidential press conferences, like as many times as Fauci touches his face when he's shaking his head at Trump, or, you know.
People could bet how many times I'm going to call people in Iowa a dingus.
I love it. So Todd, you've covered the legislature, Iowa politics for a long time through financial crises and things like that. Does that give us any idea of what to expect, or is this uncharted territory?
Well, it may be uncharted in scope. I mean, you've got so many revenue streams. I mean, usually if you have an economic downturn, you take, moderate hits in a few places, but some revenue still continues to flow in. For gambling taxes, for one thing, are usually a little bit stable. But in this case, your sales taxes are gonna dive. Your income tax, because of all the unemployment, is going to fall. The casinos are closed. The lottery outlets are closed. So you're going to have a decline in gambling taxes. It's across the board. They're going to see revenue reductions. We don't know exactly how bad it is, but if you look at other states, you're looking at places that are talking about 10, 15, 20% revenue reductions, which would be astronomically bad. So the governor's got some powers at her disposal. She can use some of the reserve funds up to about $20 million, although I think she may have tapped that first $20 million for some small business assistance. But the legislative council or legislature may give her more authority to take money out of those rainy day funds to cover expenses and in the absence of revenue. She can do across the board tax cuts, but as James alluded to, they were very critical of Chet Culver for doing that the last time the budget fell off a cliff. I think ultimately the legislature is going to have to return and, deal with these shortfalls. They're going to probably, even though the state's got healthy reserves, about $800 million, the federal government is sending money in. But I think, eventually, even if, the pandemic sort of, works itself out by the end of the year, I think you're looking at budget cuts, and they could be pretty painful.
One thing earlier today, Senator Chuck Grassley was talking about. He believes that the federal government needs to do another round to help small businesses and hospitals and state and local governments. He said, because the federal government really has shut down the economy, he feels it's necessary for Congress to step up and provide more funding to fill that void. Because like Todd said, the revenue is down all across the board. Gas tax is down because nobody's going anywhere, nobody's buying gas. That revenue goes directly into the road use tax fund. So they're looking at a downturn of maybe 25%, depending on how long this continues. And that 25% is probably an optimistic forecast early in the pandemic. And so it's only going to get worse.
I was going to say, they're probably wishing that they were like South Dakota and they tax groceries. That's maybe the one thing that people are still buying, but yeah, we don't tax much of that here. So
the only state handling this worse than Iowa is South Dakota. So
yeah, yep.
Did you all get your Corona bucks yet?
No, Adam.
I did.
I don't know if I'm gonna get them. I have no idea what's gonna happen.
I think everybody gets them. So I tweeted yesterday, thank you, Andrew Yang, for my Corona check, and it was like my best tweet ever because the Yang people are just so gracious. And
yeah, they're very responsive, aren't they?
yeah, that's one way to put it. Do you remember they several months ago before the caucuses, they Yang gang a newsroom, and so they called everyone in our newsroom.
Yeah.
Do you remember?
Yeah. I remember 50 years ago when that happened. Yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it resulted in several stories, as I remember.
It resulted in several headaches and annoyances.
A lot of favorable coverage from there on out. Yeah.
I mean, you bring up a good point, though, that bailing out businesses, bailing out individuals, at some point, where we focus the money is really important. And I think that our governments have been focusing a lot on bailing out the businesses. Meanwhile, $1,200, if we get it, right? Because some people are not going to get it, and there's a lot of undocumented people who are not going to get it, and people who are working in the factories and the food processing plants who are at the center of this epidemic are not going to get it. And $1,200, it gets you nowhere. I mean, Steve Mnuchin thinks it's going to last us 10 weeks. He's obviously never paid a mortgage. And we live in Iowa where it's affordable to live.
You can hardly get any caviar for that amount. I don't know. That's like 1 week of caviar. I don't know.
Adam, I'll have to start buying Busch Light now. Whatever will I do? This is a pittance. And even if in a fantasy land, life could return back to normal by the fall, which it won't, by the way, like the repercussions of this we're going to see for, years to come. That it's, just like with the recession of 2008, it changed, it changed the way people did business. This is going to just change the way we live forever. So
I want to go to another question. So governor's been criticized for being pretty slow to impose restrictions on individuals, but she's moved pretty quickly or gradually, but pretty swiftly to decrease regulations, both on individuals and businesses. I've praised her for some of that. She cut regulations on healthcare that will help us respond to the challenge. But on environmental and agriculture regulations, there's been some concerns. Todd, you've talked to some of those advocates and looked into that. What did you learn?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of unease with the governor's part of the governor's order that sort of relaxes the enforcement of a lot of environmental regulations, mostly aimed at various folks who have permits, stormwater, also permits to operate concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, confinements. They've waived the rule that prohibits a farmer from, for instance, putting more hogs in a confinement operation than the operation is designed to hold, on the logic that they may have to hold on to hogs because of market disruption. But that raises the question among a lot of environmental groups, what are you going to do with all that extra manure if your manure management plan is for, say, 5,000 hogs, and now you've got more than that in the facility? What are you doing with all that extra manure? Is it going to spill? Are you going to put it on cropland beyond the point that is sort of agriculturally necessary, and then you get more runoff into lakes and streams, causing all sorts of problems? So there's some question about whether relaxing those rules is a good idea. But at the same time, while the rules are relaxing, the process of permitting large-scale hog confinements is continuing. Permits are still being granted. And folks are frustrated because they want to weigh in with public comments on that process, and with social distancing and meetings being held telephonically and all of that, it's made it really difficult for people to weigh in, but the decisions are going forward anyway.
I think this is a great example of people taking advantage of a crisis to get things that they've wanted all along. We've seen the grocers get the bottle bill basically shut down, at least through the duration of this pandemic. We're seeing, agricultural interests get some rules relaxed. It's not clear at all how that helps us get through the pandemic by allowing more hogs in a confinement building. But, it's beyond me to understand how that helps anybody other than the farmers who wanted more hogs in the first place. So it's a good example of take advantage of the situation. And when it's over, let's see if those rules get reinforced or reinstated. I know what my money is on.
Yeah, well, it's all part of, nationally, you've got the Trump administration doing the same thing on a much larger scale, basically, cutting the legs out from under all sorts of environmental regulations, letting industries regulate themselves, relaxing all sorts of enforcement. And they're also rushing through rule changes while folks are unable to sort of, make moves to stop or slow down or even to comment. So yeah, this is all to take advantage of this crisis, as you suggest, that, these are things that we want to do. Normally they would stir controversy and generate a lot of media attention and people would get upset. But right now we can sort of do it under cover of COVID and maybe people won't notice. It's remarkably cynical and short-sighted, but I think remarkably cynical and short-sighted is unlike the Trump administration flag. It's like a little motto underneath.
It's also, I mean, it's also coming at the cost of, like, sure, you can act quickly to deregulate these whole industries that you've, been promising for a while you would do, because that's like your politics. But in the meantime, you can't issue shelter at home orders. You can't do the things that you would need to do to be proactive to save lives. I mean, it's craven. It's a craven disregard for human life. And, it's being willing to sacrifice, that theoretical number, which we don't even know if it's true, the 2% of Americans who may die from this, in order to what? Deregulate so you can get rid of some bottle bills and, maybe, reverse our constitutional right to an abortion, which she was not able to do, but, gave it her best shot. But it's really upsetting.
I want to talk more about the president.
Why?
Well, we've had several readers asked us about the president's press conferences. They also mentioned the governor's press conferences, but probably more Americans are watching press conferences now than they ever have before. Some people are worried that when you put the president up there, who has a knack for not always telling the truth, that it might be sending the wrong message. Just a question for anyone who wants to jump in. Do you think that the daily updates from elected leaders are still helpful?
Well, they're the greatest press conferences ever held in the history of the United States. So, I mean, if that's an answer, I think that's where I stand.
It's interesting, Adam, that according to a poll that came out today, fewer people are watching those presidential news conferences.
Well, the ratings are they beat the Super Bowl. I'm pretty sure.
The supply is so high now that the demand has dropped off because there's so much supply.
Yeah.
Well, people get sick of all the winning, so they're not
exactly.
I mean, it makes a good point that the president has turned these into campaign rallies. Like, he showed a propaganda video. He gets up there and he lies. And people just carry it, CNN with their garbage crayons. They're like, oh, the president's not telling the truth, as if people pay attention to that, as if it matters. So I think that is a very valid criticism. But I think as you move on down the line, to like the state level where Reynolds is giving a press conference every day, people do need updates. We do need transparency. The press needs to be able to ask questions, because right now questions are not getting answered. Emails are not being returned. People, ask any journalist across the state. They're having a real hard time just finding out basic information, getting phone calls answered, like I said, emails returned. And so the press conferences offer, at least the media, that ability to ask them questions. But as anybody who's watched them knows, you don't get follow-up questions. Like, you basically get like one shot to ask some really complex questions about math and metrics and epidemiology, and you're lucky if you get an answer. And if you get one of those non-answer answers, it's hard to press them. So on the one hand, we need answers, but on the other hand, it's really valid to say, we're putting on a show, but what value is that show? Because at least here in Iowa, that show is not giving us hardly any information or any knowledge beyond, what they could just put out in a press release every day with those numbers. So, I hope that people are watching. I hope they are paying attention. I hope they're noticing who honestly answers questions and who doesn't. And they remember that when we have to go vote in November.
Yeah, I've definitely been frustrated with Reynolds, Governor Reynolds at times, but I think that certainly she's doing a better job than the president at being forthright with people and, giving the most accurate answer she can. James, you've covered a lot of gubernatorial press conferences in your day. What's your review on the governor's performance the past few weeks?
I give her props for doing daily news conferences, because I think it's really important for the elected leader to be out there talking to Iowans and trying to explain what's going on. I agree with Liz that it would be great if there were follow-up questions, so there was a more thorough explanation of what's going on. I think if you talk to news reporters, will always say that we wish there was news conferences were longer. We had more opportunity to ask questions. I give her credit for bringing in people from Department of Public Health and some of the other agencies and deferring to them to let them answer questions rather than just answering questions herself when, everybody would expect that the Director of Public Health would have a more thorough understanding of some issues than the governor. And I think, she hasn't tried to make it a political rally like President Trump has done with his news conferences. It's just that we want more. If you cover these sorts of news conferences, it's pretty easy to get cynical because they often turn into a dog and pony show. But more information would be better. More follow-up questions would be better. So it's a little bit frustrating from that regard. But I hope she continues to do them.
Today was a dog and pony show, though. Like, she spent time showing that ridiculous Ashton Kutcher video. Like, that is not valuable to Iowans. That is really ridiculous. And it is great to bring in people from other departments, but the value is in the answers they give. And, and we're just not getting real answers. All we keep getting is that circular logic of, well, we're using data and metrics. Well, what data and metrics? Well, the data and metrics you can't see, and everybody at every level is giving those. So yes, we do need them. We do need to be able to have that opportunity, but to talk to her, but to say that the value of them right now is that they're happening, but what is coming out of them is just really an example to the voters of Iowa about what a lack of transparency we have, and what a lack of leadership.
And they're, they have a run out the clock feel to them. I mean, the governor comes and reads basically a press release that all of us could read. I mean, reporters get that in their inboxes. I realize she wants to update the numbers, but we do get the numbers. And then they sort of go through each of the regions, and those also are easy to look at now with the new website, which they should deserve some kudos for making a lot better. But then when you do all that at the top, and then you have sort of your, what you want to announce for the day, whether it be a website or Test Iowa or whatever you want to announce. By the time you get to questions, then you limit it to just this handful of questions, and people don't get follow-ups. They have to try to ask 4 questions at a time because they know they've only got one shot. So I think more of the press conference needs to be devoted to answering questions, especially considering that some of these reporters, from TV stations that I've heard, are relaying questions from Iowans to the governor. And I think she has an obligation to answer more of those questions.
Yeah.
One of the overlooked values of her news conferences, though, is reading the comments on the Facebook chat feed. I mean, it's a real look into what Iowans are thinking or lack of thinking, I guess.
Yeah, I started watching them on the Gazette site, so I didn't see that anymore. Because I was watching them on Facebook. I'm like, oh, this is even more depressing.
Hey guys, people in glass houses, we shouldn't throw stones because there's a live chat going on right now in the comments on YouTube. So play it cool, James.
A pro tip, the way you know if somebody's really smart and is telling the truth is if they use all caps. And they're like, well, obviously that's true.
I just want angry emojis. That's all I want, flowing right at me.
We're about halfway through the program, so I want to switch gears a little bit, step away from coronavirus questions a little bit and talk about partisan politics. And I'm going to turn it over to James to kind of guide our discussion.
Thanks, Adam. We're going to start with the presidential race. In case you haven't noticed, it's still going on despite all the COVID-19 sucking the oxygen out of the news reporting. Bernie Sanders, the second place finisher in the Iowa caucuses, recently suspended his campaign. It was kind of in other news part of the newspaper and websites, leaving only Joe Biden, the fourth place finisher in Iowa, in the race. And Iowa's status as first in the nation was already in jeopardy. And Todd, do you think Biden's nomination reflects poorly on the caucuses? And prospects for first in the nation in 2022 or 20. When is it? 2024. I can't count. 2020.
Did he actually get fourth place? Because I don't think AP has called that race.
No, I don't think so.
There's that one Clinton County precinct. That...
Yeah.
I think that's it. We're still waiting. The app. It's the app. So, yeah, I mean, if there are a lot of factors here. Obviously, if Joe Biden loses to Donald Trump, then Iowa Democrats can say, well, we tried to warn you. We tried to not give him one of the 3 tickets out, but you took him anyway. So that could be one argument. If he wins, I don't know. There may be a move to change the nominating process, whether he gets in the way to save Iowa or steps into that. I mean, that's, remains to be seen. In a way, the caucuses were good for him in that there barely anybody wrote about or even noticed that Joe Biden got fourth. And so he was able to do really poorly and not be the main story out of Iowa. He got a little cover from our problems and lived to fight another day. So maybe he should send a box of chocolates to the app developers for giving him that breathing room.
It doesn't seem like Joe Biden really has a grudge against Iowa. Last cycle, there was some speculation that Hillary Clinton didn't like the Iowa caucuses. She felt like she got burned by the caucuses, and that if she was president, she might seek to alter the process. I don't get that sense from Joe Biden, but I also know that even if he's president, he certainly has an enormous influence over Democratic politics, but not absolute influence. And I think there's enough of a sentiment in the party that something needs to change, and it's hard to tell how this kind of left versus centrist thing will shake out. The people who supported Senator Sanders are very frustrated at Biden, and so maybe to bring them in, there's some way that the process changes. But then again, the Sanders people have done really well in Iowa. They think it got stolen from them each time, but I mean, he performed really well. So I don't know. It's also just really difficult to make any kind of normal political calculation right now, because we just have no idea how elections and things are going to shake out even this year, and then beyond this year. There's really no way of saying.
Well, Joe Biden's an institutional choice. Like, he's a safe choice. People are making safe choices now. Nobody's going out there to make big, wide sweeping change. Lord knows America needs wide sweeping change, but it seems like the electorate is not interested in voting for somebody who's going to make the necessary changes to fix our nation, or even our caucuses, our electoral cycle. So, I mean, there's nothing about Joe Biden's candidacy that would suggest that should he become president, things are going to change. I mean, he's pretty much just like the placeholder, the one who's supposed to make things stable from, this absolutely insane presidency, and now, this global pandemic. So I think we have another caucus in a few more years, because you just don't see the will of the people out there to make the foundational changes we need to make it so everybody's voice is heard.
Well, it'll be easier for them to be heard when everybody's on a Zoom conference call, caucusing. And
that goes so well. We haven't had any problems at all with our Zoom.
No problems at all. And it'll be a little difficult to realign, they do that second alignment at your precinct caucus. But, hey, we'll work it out by then. We'll all be Zoom experts, ninjas, whatever.
The other thing is, it's how ironic politics can become is you have Bernie Sanders dropping out of the race. He was mathematically pretty much eliminated at that point. But at this exact same moment, all of these things he talked about, a healthcare system that can't handle things, workers being, working in lousy places with, poor conditions and no health coverage and bad wages, and all of those problems that he described are now on steroids in this pandemic. And it's just one of, at that moment when his campaign ends, here's exhibit A as to why as in his arguments for why we need all the things that he advocated. So it'll be interesting what role he plays going forward. Obviously, he's in the Senate and has a voice, but within the party, I think the pandemic gives him and his supporters maybe a little more leverage as they try to push the party in that direction. So we'll see what happens.
I mean, there's no doubt that Sanders and Sanders people will say, this proves that we were right. But, people have been talking about, well, if we had a different healthcare system with more people covered right now, would that be better? So yeah, that's the case. But Sanders advocated for a healthcare system that's much bigger and much more overgrown than any other existing healthcare system in the world. So it's one thing to say, well, we could change the healthcare system to better equip us to handle this. It's another thing to say that Bernie Sanders' plan would be the correct one. So,
well, and Bernie Sanders likes to talk about all of the United States is the only basically first world nation that doesn't have a national healthcare plan of some sort. And the results are pretty uneven when you look around the world at the response to COVID-19, whether those national health services, performed well or not. In some cases they did, in some other cases they didn't. So I'm not sure that, Medicare for all would be a panacea in an epidemic or a pandemic like we're going through right now. Perhaps having a centralized healthcare system might smooth out some of the bumps. You wouldn't have states bidding against each other for ventilators and masks and things like that. But, if you look around the world, the results are pretty uneven in getting the performance in some countries versus, Germany is held up as a better example, but it's pretty uneven, I would say.
Well, I mean, it's hard to say who's a better example at the moment because we're just not through it. Right. So we just you can't even make those determinations because we're not through it. I mean, it's clear that people who aren't doing what they need to do to be successful in flattening a curve, and that's us. But it is hard to say because, even some of the places from week to week, you can read a story where it's like, oh, this country has been doing everything great. And then the next week it's like their numbers are shooting back through the roof again. So I think it's really, really hard to start making blanket judgments like that.
It almost seems to me that it's not so much whether they have a national health service or not, but the authoritarian countries, China, eventually sort of lock things down. South Korea seems to be having better results than the United States in many ways. Those countries where the government is more authoritarian seem to be producing better results. But yeah, we're not through it. So, we don't really know the final outcome. We don't know the ending to this story.
South Korea definitely didn't use the same toolbox as China did. Their government might be somewhat more invasive than ours, but not compared to China. And so I think, one takeaway is countries are different and there might be different models that work, that maybe one is better than the other, but there might be different strategies for doing different things. And so my understanding is South Korea did not do nearly as widespread of lockdown orders as China did, but they did have the technology and the medical resources in place to test and surveil people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it may not be Bernie's plan that's the right thing to do, but I think after this, it's going to be difficult for people to say, well, let's not do Bernie's plan. Let's get rid of the Affordable Care Act and let's go back to the way we were before. I think the problems have been.
We're doing Biden care now.
Well, yeah, or whatever. But it's like, Trump talked about his big beautiful plan. There's been all of these. We'll repeal and replace ACA. There's never been a replacement plan that's been real. So, this is a real issue, and the healthcare system has real problems. And leaving it the way it is not going to be acceptable to people, a larger number of people after this episode.
Well, what's happening right now is like people aren't really seeing the costs to our healthcare system at the moment. Right now, those are being kicked down the road. Hospitals are eating the cost. Insurance companies are eating the cost. They're not, because they can't charge patients for a lot of these things. So right now, they're just absorbing it. And pretty soon, it's going to hit a crisis moment. And that means that like in a year from now, insurance premiums are going to shoot through the roof. Like this is a real problem. So while the Bernie plan might not have been the issue, which I actually am fine with Medicare for all. I think it could solve our problems, but that's not the plan we're litigating right now. But I think we are going to see in a year after the election a huge crisis moment, even worse for our healthcare industry. And if we don't change then, and if we don't have a leader who's capable of making change then we're just going to be continuing to compound this healthcare problem that we have in America.
Speaking of leaders, Matt R. from Cedar Rapids is asking, who will Joe Biden choose as a running mate? I think Barack Obama is available if he's asked, but there may be other choices.
So he said it'll be a woman. There's all the usual calculations of if there's a competent woman from a swing state, that would be a great person to do. Obviously, there's competent women from every state, but I mean,
binders. Adam needs the binder.
On my desk. But I mean, I think there's maybe a list. There's a list somewhere of 15 or 20 people that are kind of being talked about. One interesting thing that struck me this week is Gretchen Whitmer, who's the governor of Michigan, has been talked about recently because she's seen as having a very aggressive response to the coronavirus. But it kind of struck me like, she's not in any position to join a vice presidential campaign right now. It would be I'm sure she's committed to the people of her state and handling this crisis. It appears likely this will go on at some level through the November election, at least. And so there's a lot of anyone who's in an executive position right now is going to have a very difficult time going to run for vice president. But obviously the women who are in legislative positions or who are not in office right now, Stacey Abrams is a common one that's been talked about. People have mentioned the other women who ran for president this year, Kamala Harris. I don't think probably Elizabeth Warren would be interested, but I don't know.
Well, I think you have a problem here because, if you pick a very successful and politically ambitious woman, that vice president is not a great role. You don't really launch from vice president into the presidency. Also, a lot of, like you said, a lot of the qualified, ambitious women that get us all excited, Elizabeth Warren being one of them, she's currently doing a bang-up job in the Senate right now, like fighting the special interest lobbies who are trying to cravenly use a pandemic to line their pockets. So, we don't need her to go be a figurehead for Joe Biden. We need her to do the work in the Senate. And so many of those women, like the governor of Michigan, they're doing the work and we need them to do the work. And there's also the problem of Joe Biden's campaign. It's this kind of shadow issue of the sexual assault allegations. And I think for a successful young woman out there who wants a career in politics, are you gonna hang your future on a man who has that right now looming over him? And people just don't know what to do with that story. That story just keeps getting like ham-handed. Like people are just kind of like, what do we do with this? And but it's a shadow. It's something people have to handle. And I think if you jump into that VP spot, what are you going to do if 8 months from now you then have to go out on TV to defend him? And I think that's something anybody who jumps in that spot has to consider.
Liz, doesn't President Trump's conduct sort of negate any allegations against Joe Biden? I mean, it's just like, well, I'm not as bad as he is.
Oh my God, James, what the hell? Like,
I mean, that's the way people are going to look at it.
You can't do the balance of which sexual assault is worse.
The lesser of two evils. I mean, that's the way people vote.
I mean, no, of course it is. Of course it is. Of course it is. But that's completely immoral. You can't say one person's sexual assault was worse or better than someone else's. Right. And that's the problem with our politics. And, again, the Joe Biden thing is still being adjudicated right now. We're still learning more. That's still being uncovered. So like, even I'm not even comfortable saying like I have even a full knowledge to be able to make a judgment on that right now. And I think many people feel like that. So that's why it's kind of like people are just kind of like not talking about it. But no, we don't get to like say one person's is worse or better.
But we do.
I can.
But we do. Todd, do you have a favorite for running mate?
No, I don't have a favorite. I think, the people that are mentioned, a lot of them would be really good. I mean, obviously, we saw Kamala Harris run for president here. She's impressive and super smart, and a prosecutor who can, talk about somebody that could debate the vice president. I mean, that's obviously, I think she could do that with one part of her brain tied behind her back. It's, Amy Klobuchar is the kind of the Midwestern senator who helped him out when he needed help and might have some appeal with those kind of, the Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Rust Belt, hot dish belt. I don't know what you want to call it, the fish fry belt. But it's, and he may, maybe he does what John McCain did and pick someone who's well regarded in Democratic circles that maybe the rest of the country hasn't heard about so much, like a member of Congress, a member of the House instead of a senator or a governor. So
Wendy Davis.
Yeah.
A game changer, if you will. Yeah. A Sarah Palin game changer.
Yeah, you'd want it to change the game the other way, theoretically, but.
Looking ahead, we've got here in Iowa, we have a primary election coming up in June, and then the general, obviously, in November. There's a lot of talk about mail-in voting, so people aren't standing in long lines and going to polling places. Linda S. from Iowa City is asking whether Iowa will get it together in time to go to all absentee voting in November. What's the thought there? I mean, we're seeing Secretary of State Paul Pate and our county auditors encouraging everybody to use that option. Will people be ready to go to the polls in November?
So at this point, I think they are planning to promote those options, that they're not planning. They're going to, in some counties, are going to reduce the number of polling places for the June election, at least. We're not sure about November. As far as I know, it doesn't look like they're going to cancel in-person polling this year yet. I think it's good to do as much vote by mail as we can. But there, with how the dates are set up to print ballots and stuff, there are legitimate logistical issues with doing that. But these are problems that we need to solve, long term. Like, we should be able to do a vote by mail election. We need to have that infrastructure in place. And right now, as far as I know, counties, if they want to do an extra mailing, counties would have to pay for that. Some counties aren't in a position to do that. So the Secretary of State's office or some other state entity would have to come up with some support for that. So I think we need to do that as much as possible, particularly for the June election. For the November election, I mean, we all should hope that we're at some point past just a general blanket social distancing order by that point, that we have some new tools with testing for antibodies and testing for the virus, that at least some people will be able to go out and do their business. But that's such a big question mark right now that I think people should plan on voting by mail for both June and November.
Yeah, I think they need to make it a priority to figure this out. You're at home, you're not doing anything else, stop watching Tiger King, let's go. I think this is, like Adam said, something we need to have figured out for the long term anyway. So right now is a really good time to start removing some of those barriers, sorting them out, so that we should just anticipate it being necessary by November. There's a lot of forecasting out there that says, we could dip down, and then by the fall, late fall, it could, we could see a rise in cases again. So we just need to do whatever we have to do to make it so that people can have a voice and don't have to show up to the polls. And, I think that also enfranchises all Iowans even better. So this is a win-win here if we can solve it. And also, anybody listening, make sure you fill out your absentee ballot form and mail it in.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna find out if we've got leaders who want legitimately, or they want people to vote, want everyone to vote, or whether they're going to try to game this. I mean, that's what we saw in Wisconsin. Republicans tried to game it. In Iowa, the Secretary of State gets a gold star for sending out absentee ballot request forms. I would have actually liked to see him send out actual ballots, but I understand that we're not in that position at this point. I think by November, we don't know. There's all the talk of the second peak, and we could be right in the middle of that at that point. So I think we need to plan for an election where most people vote by mail, and we need leaders that are going to make that happen and not make excuses and say they can't afford it. And because people, voting is fundamental. What do they say back in Schoolhouse Rock? I don't know, but it was important. I know that. I remember
that. Back in homeschool, huh? We're kind of winding down here on our time, but I want to talk a little bit about the primary races that are coming up in June. And Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said today that the Iowa Senate race is going to be a marquee matchup. Whoever is running against Senator Joni Ernst. There's a 5-way primary there, but yet it doesn't feel like there's a marquee matchup going on, or a primary with 5 people running for a Senate seat. Adam, is this race sort of under the radar at this point?
I don't know. So we were talking earlier, Senator Ernst came in 2014. She came out of a 5 or 6-way primary that very much at the time seemed like it was a hot thing that a lot of people were talking about. And this one, not so much. And obviously the last month or two, you could attribute that to coronavirus coverage. That's kind of sucking up all the attention. But I think even before that, it didn't seem like there was a lot going on. Certainly the establishment has surrounded or come down to support Teresa Greenfield, who's a former U.S. House candidate. But there are at least 4 other candidates that are still running. But it just doesn't seem like they're getting the kind of media they need. And also, obviously, they're not able to run their traditional ground games of getting volunteers together to phone bank and knock doors and things like that. So I'm not sure. It doesn't seem like it's as much of a thing, but I'm not a registered Democrat. So maybe other people are getting maybe they're getting a lot.
You're not getting the phone calls. Huh?
Yeah, not me.
Yeah. So does this make it easier or give the candidates like a Teresa Greenfield in this race, who have the money, who have the backing from party leaders and power brokers, does this give them a leg up in these primaries over the other candidates who are not raising as much money and perhaps don't have the same name recognition? Thoughts on that? Who has the advantage?
I don't know. Like, it's hard to say that if all that money is really going to help Teresa Greenfield, if she can't use it to reach people, if she does like digital ad buys, what about the people who don't have the internet, so robocalls, I seriously question how effective those are. And then there's also the question of, how effective are those mailers and everything like that. So you just, and in this field, you just haven't seen a big personality really differentiate themselves right now. I think the race is about how mostly Iowans do not like Joni Ernst. And in order to run a successful race, you need to make it be about more than just not being Joni Ernst. And so I think all campaigns are struggling to find a way to reach people and to campaign in this environment. And it will be interesting to see, but I don't think it's Teresa Greenfield's to run away with. I think that other people still have a chance here.
I think we're going to have to leave it there, folks. I want to wrap it up by thanking our season ticket holders for sticking with us through this. Our next scheduled Pints and Politics is June 4th, and we'll keep everyone up to date, posted on our plans, whether it'll be in person or we'll be doing another virtual.
We'll all be covered in plastic wrap.
Yeah,
there you go.
Bubble wrap. We're also planning to make up for the March show that we had to cancel with a Pints and Politics in November. Hopefully we'll have something to talk about then. For the latest information on the future of Pints and Politics and other Gazette events, visit thegazette.com/special events. You can sign up for the Pints and Politics newsletter at thegazette.com/sections/e-newsletters. Thanks again for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this. Drink up and stay well. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, y'all.
Wash your hands.